On behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, welcome back to our webinar series exploring prescribed fire for forest management. Before we begin today, we acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies land of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all indigenous peoples. My name is Tommy Gunn, Great Lakes Oak Ecosystem Forester with the American Bird Conservancy, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. In my opinion, the timing for this webinar topic couldn't be better. With spring turkey season just around the corner, or already underway for some of us, many are preparing to step into the woods with the goal of chasing gobbles. However, spring is also a time when prescribed fire activity typically reaches its peak across the U.S. As someone who spends their spring alternating between camo and Nomex, I'm excited to hear from both of our speakers about how fire and turkeys share the spring season. Our invited speakers for this webinar series explore the many facets of prescribed fire related to forest and forest management. They are invited to provide their perspective and offer advice on how we can advance prescribed fire as a forest management tool in the future. We don't expect our speakers or anyone to have definitive answers about what the future will look like. Rather, we hope this series will provide insights, pose questions, and stimulate our collective thinking. Before I introduce our guests, we have a few quick housekeeping items to review. Session recordings, additional resources, evaluation links, and information about continuing education will all be available on the website. We will do our best to ensure the recordings are posted within 2 weeks of today's session. To receive continuing education, you must complete the Microsoft form provided to you during the session. This link will be posted periodically throughout today in the chat. If you have any questions, please email Wisconsin Forestry Center at uwsp.edu. This series is hosted by the Wisconsin Forestry Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Department of Forestry. An evaluation link will be provided today, and we hope you'll provide feedback so we can continue to improve our series. Although you are attending virtually, we still want to hear from you. Please type any questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please type any comments you have into the chat. The chat feature may not be monitored for questions, but our technical host is monitoring for content. We'll do our best to address all questions and comments, but may be limited by time. Before we begin today, please say hi in the chat and let us know where you're listening from. Last but not least, we sincerely appreciate our sponsors for making this opportunity free for all attendees. Today, we would like to highlight some of our sponsors. Our platinum sponsor, the National Wild Turkey Federation, and our gold sponsors, the Nature Conservancy, Ruffed Grouse Society, and American Woodcock Society. And now it's time to introduce our first presenter. Dr. Mike Chamberlain is the National Wild Turkey Federation Distinguished Professor at the University of Georgia. He obtained his BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Science at Virginia Tech, a Master's in Wildlife Ecology at Mississippi State, and a Ph.D. in Forest Resources, also from Mississippi State. Mike has conducted research on a variety of species, but is best known for his extensive work on wild turkeys over the past 30 years. He is active on various social media platforms where he posts regular content about wild turkeys and science, and maintains the Wild Turkey Lab that provides an extensive array of information about wild turkey ecology and management.
Thanks, Tommy. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with everyone, and hopefully this information is relevant to everyone listening. What I'm going to do is actually describe kind of an overview of some research that myself and some colleagues have been conducting over the past 15-ish or so years, kind of looking at various aspects of wild turkey ecology relative to prescribed fires that are used on a number of our study sites. Now, I will admit this work is restricted entirely to the southeastern United States, and the four systems that we're operating in are in many ways different from other forest systems, but I think the overall take home of what we've found in our research should be of use to the group, regardless of the kind of the forest types that you live in. Next slide. My research actually started because of changes in ignition methods used in various forests of the southeastern United States. So as we were studying turkeys back around 2009, 2010, 2011, we developed a GPS backpack transmitter that could be used with wild turkeys. And once that was developed, it kind of opened up our ability to better understand how turkeys were responding to fire. And in particular, it became apparent that many of the study sites that we were working on had moved from kind of the historical kind of standard drip torch ignition method to aerial ignition methods. Fires were behaving quite a bit differently than they had been maybe a decade before, and we were keen to try to understand how turkeys were responding to those prescribed fires, which I'll go into, particularly relative to timing and scale. Next slide. You know, you see images like this on social media, and in my neck of the woods, prescribed fire is, no pun intended, is a very hot topic, particularly during the spring. The reality is that images like this get portrayed on social media, and the narrative or the rhetoric, if you will, is the forests are all being burned. They're all being burned during the nesting season, and there's extensive nest loss, and turkeys are being impacted because of the timing and scale of these fires. In reality, when you start looking at the percentages of forest that are considered fire or fire maintained forest, what's actually being treated is a very small percentage on the landscape. And most of the fires that are being conducted in my neck of the woods are dormant season fires, but obviously you do see some variability. And so the point is that, at least in the wild turkey world, this bird is living on landscapes in the South that, if they're managed with fire, much of the landscape is not being managed with fire, and most of the fires are being conducted at a time when nesting is not occurring. But when you see images like this, and you realize that this topic becomes really polarizing, it certainly kind of spoke to the need for us to dig into this topic and try to understand how turkeys were responding to these fires. Next slide. At the same time, while we were initiating this research, across the Southeast, there were declines in wild turkey productivity that were being observed. These declines were being well publicized. What you're looking at on the right is simply a graph showing smoothed poult per hen ratios across a number of states, and as you see from that figure, most of the trends are the same or were the same in many states. The rate of decline in productivity obviously varied from one state to the next. But when you put kind of all of the information that we had available to us at the time that we started this research, you're seeing situations where, on average, about 75 to 80% of all nests are failing, and about two-thirds of all broods are failing. And the outcome of that is that a very small percentage of nests are being successful in a way that would produce poults that survive. And so when you look at these data, there was fairly strong consensus across the southeastern states that something was amiss. And so you factor in these population declines, you have this question about prescribed fire and the narrative around it, and that kind of served as the impetus for us to start this work. Next slide. Back up a little bit and just kind of think about the world from a turkey's perspective. Turkeys are the largest galliform in North America. They're a large game bird. They do require diversity of habitats across their annual cycle. So basically, you have a bird that uses one cover type during fall and winter, shifts to a different type of vegetative community in the spring during breeding season. and then once again shifts to different vegetative communities during the summer and into early fall. So it really speaks to the need to have diverse vegetative communities across the landscape. They use a what's akin to an exploded lek mating system, and all that means is that they tend to go back to the same breeding areas year after year, unless those areas are altered in some way. And so there are places on the landscape that, from a breeding perspective, are considerably more important than other places. And there's a fidelity to those areas through time, from one generation to the next. Without question, turkeys require early successional plant communities because they, outside of when they're roosting, their entire life cycle is being driven by plants that are from about our waist or thigh to the ground. So early successional plants are key, and often that requires disturbance. And if you look at the world from a turkey's perspective, their primary means of survival is their sight, their vision. So you kind of factor that in with this early successional plant community requirement, and it kind of speaks volumes to the need that plant communities be maintained in a way where turkeys can walk through, navigate through, and see through the vegetation around them. Next slide. So if you're in the southeast, this is a maybe a common sight for you. If you're in other parts of the world and you're thinking about kind of the how the world looks from a turkey's perspective, you can just replace these pine trees with some other type of tree. It really doesn't matter. The point is that the understory is open. This is pine forest, or this is, insert word, woods that benefit turkeys. There's early successional plant communities are abundant in the understory, and they can navigate through and see through their environment. Next slide. This is not. And in my travels, I see a lot of forest across North America that look like this. Whether it's pine or hardwood is irrelevant. What you're seeing is high stem density, a lack of understory cover, and interestingly enough, in the South, it's common to see those fire scorch marks on trees in stands like this. So in this particular case, prescribed fire was applied to this stand, but the net benefit of that fire is being compromised by the fact that the basal area is so high that you are unable to get sunlight to the ground and see a positive plant response. Next slide. This is actually not piney woods that are beneficial for turkeys either, despite the fact that there's been thinning that's occurred in this stand. You're seeing that a lack of management is creating a situation where the plant community is very dense. Turkeys will use edges of these forests, but they're not navigating through the center of these forests. And if you advance the slide, a figure should pop up. This is what we see in landscapes that are managed, or in this case, not managed, in a way that causes the forest structure to look like this. And what you're seeing is several thousand GPS locations across a 20 square mile area. And what this hen is doing is she's simply using the edges of forest that look structurally like the picture in the background. And this becomes problematic because we're seeing that predation risk increases on landscapes that look like this because of the need to use these linear landscape features like roads and rights of way. The other issue that you see in forests that are not managed that resemble this is there's a lack of usable space, and what that causes is a turkey or any other species that needs early successional plant communities to expand their home range and use more space because of the lack of usable space in the core of some of these stands. Next slide. So then the question becomes, well, okay, what's the type of habitats that wild turkeys would need if you were using prescribed fire to manage them, or even not? And so one thing we see common in stands that are managed with prescribed fire is that you can produce exceptional quality brood habitat, but it's often dictated by basal area. So kind of back to this interaction between fire and basal area. And I put this picture in here simply to show that in a lower basal area stand where prescribed fire is applied on a fairly consistent return interval, say every 2 to 3 years, you do see exceptional brood habitat in these stands, depending on the basal area, of course. And from a brooding perspective, we tend to see that broods are going to preferentially select areas that are burned this year or burned last year. And at least in pine dominated landscapes, the juxtaposition to hardwoods, like you see in the background, becomes important. The other thing that you tend to see is that fires that are kind of reaching into the early growing season will often produce plant communities that resemble this. This stand was burned on March the 20th. And this is what it looked like. I took this on June the 15th of that same year. You tend to see that plant communities will shift away from some of the woody plants that often dominate the understory, and that produces a lot of legumes and forbs that are beneficial to turkeys, not just broods, but also adults. Next slide. So let's kind of go through these four topics, and these four topics kind of come about from various aspects of the work that we've done. And the broader question being, well, okay, well, how does fire affect turkeys? This has been something that's been discussed since the days of Herbert Stoddard, and I kind of boil it down to four things. Are we losing nest and broods directly to fire? Are turkeys avoiding or selecting stands that are managed with prescribed fire? Are these fires influencing their behavior or their movements in any way, whether it's a positive or negative? And a particular, that's why it's emphasized in this slide, it is the scale. That's one of the questions that's posed very frequently in the southeast and southern part of the United States. Is the scale of fire. And what you've seen through the last decade in particular is the use of larger scale fires, particularly on public lands, in order to meet burning mandates. And so the question then becomes, does scale matter? And if it does, can we predict out what the most appropriate scale would be? Next. And so I'll just kind of give this in a rough shot overview. If you look across the literature on research that's been conducted on wild turkeys relative to fire, there's general consensus that a 2 to 3 year return interval would be expected to produce a diverse array of nesting and brooding habitat. Obviously, there's going to be differences from site to site in some ways, particularly as you get into areas that have very poor soil productivity. That return interval may be a little longer. And when you get into areas with exceptionally rich soil productivity, that return interval may be a bit little shorter. But the bottom line is that what we see across our study sites where fire is used as a management tool is that nests and broods are generally in 1, 2, or 0 year roughs, meaning burned this year, last year, or 2 years prior. We tend to start seeing that even from a nesting perspective, hens are starting to avoid stands that were burned 3 years ago or longer. And it's just because the vegetation becomes so dense that it's very difficult for them to move through it. Next slide. If you look at that top question we had, kind of nest and brood loss, we've monitored about 1,100. It's actually about 1,350 nests now, after the nesting data we obtained from last year. But basically about, let's just say, 11 to 1,300 nests that have been monitored on sites where fire is actively used as a management tool. And we've had very few that were affected by fire. And what I mean by affected would be the actual nest bowl and the area directly around the nest bowl was consumed by the fire. We see a very common situation where turkeys may be nesting in in hardwood areas or along hardwood areas where the fire um, essentially does not impact the nest, or it approaches the nest and doesn't get close to the nest bowl. We see that fairly commonly, but we see a really small percentage of nests that are directly impacted. Interestingly enough, several of the nests that where the nest bowl was essentially consumed ended up hatching, which is interesting. We've monitored about 210 broods with GPS telemetry now, and only one of those broods was lost to a fire, and that was ended up actually being a nest that had hatched about 12 hours before the fire was ignited, and so the poults were unable to escape the fire. And again, this kind of goes back to, in many cases, birds are not nesting or brooding in these stands that are scheduled to be burned. I would note that most of the fires that are ignited on my study sites tend to be early growing season or dormant season fires. We don't see much burning in my areas beyond around the 1st of April, and that's typically associated with the fact that turkey hunting seasons are starting at that time. I would also point out that the average scale of fire across our study sites, and there's about 12 represented in this data set, range from fairly small at 50 acres to an average of well over 1,000 acres, which is quite large. And some of the individual burn units that were included in some of the subsequent modeling I'll show you extended up well over 4,000 acres, which is quite large. Next slide. When we turned and then started looking at, okay, based on GPS data, what do turkeys that have a burn occur within their home range? What do they do immediately after the fire? And what we saw is about 80% of our birds, so several thousand birds, about 80% of those birds had a burn available to them within their home range. And 87% of those birds used a burn stand if it was available at any point in their home range. Interestingly enough, we see that there are some birds that use the stand the day of the burn, and I know that Marcus is going to show some information about this as well. It's not uncommon at all to see birds back in stands within 24 hours of the fire while the stand's still smoking. And we saw that over 2/3 of the birds were back in the stand within 48 hours, and nearly all of the birds were using the stand within that first month of the fire being applied. So very common for birds to simply move away from the fire as it's occurring and then immediately return to the stand. Next. And this is kind of what that looks like. This is a fairly large fire that occurred in Louisiana on Coosatchee National Forest. And what you're seeing is the blue locations are the locations before the fire. The green locations are the locations after the fire. And then this figure in the upper right is basically showing that as you move away from the edge of the fire itself, turkeys tend to start moving in a directional way. And what that means is they're just hoofing it to some other parts of the stand. And so if you look at basically the clusters of green locations, this is a really common scenario where a lot of the use of these burn stands within the first few weeks after the fire occurs is very close to the edge of the stand, which I'll talk about why that is. And you see progressively as you move farther into the core of the stand, birds tend to not concentrate their activity, but simply move to a different part of the stand. Next. This is some similar data on a different bird showing that same fire compartment. And this is a very common scenario that we see on the upper left. You see the pink locations are roost locations. The yellow dots are GPS locations during the day. And as you see, the day of the fire, 2 weeks prior to the fire, this bird was roosting at multiple locations inside and out of the burn unit, and was essentially most of her activity was well outside of the burn unit. And then on the day of the fire, she traveled progressively closer to the edge of the stand, and she ended up roosting in the stand that had been burned earlier that day. And then for the next 2 weeks, she roosted right on the edge of the burned and unburned stand, literally to right off the fire break, essentially. And you intensively used areas within the fire, but you'll see that same trend where a lot of the use is clustered close to or adjacent to an unburned stand, which is results from various things. One being just escape cover is in that unburned stand, but two, you see that insects are recolonizing the stand from the adjacent unburned areas, and so you kind of factor that together, and it's not surprising that turkeys would exhibit that type of behavior. And this is what the stand looked like. The fire occurred on the 28th of February, and within about 2 weeks, you're getting this vegetative community that's starting to resprout its succulent green vegetation, which is very attractive to turkeys. Next. We've also found that the juxtaposition really matters relative to probability of use. And what you're seeing is this figure in the bottom left. When the distance from a burned stand to an unburned stand is very short, and in other words, directly across the fire break, there is an adjacent unburned stand. The probability that a bird is going to use that stand is very much higher than if you start progressing 2, 4, 500 meters away. And so this kind of speaks again to the probability that a bird is going to use the stand and how they're going to use it. They're going to use the edges along the burn stand. They're only going to travel a certain distance into these burn stands. And so when you're looking at the figures on the right, is basically the probability that they're just going to walk through the stand to get to other parts of the stand along the edges is going to increase as the distance to unburned stands increases, and also, which I'll show in more detail, as the severity of the fire increases. Next. We're also seeing that, at least in the deep south, winter burns are not really used until they start to green up. And so a common scenario that management agencies will use is once they start getting some burn days available to them, they will start conducting fires. It's not uncommon for me to look out my window here in Georgia and see smoke plumes or smoke settling around the house in late January and February. It's very common here in March and early April, also very common. And so what we've tended to see is these winter fires are not used at all. The birds are avoiding those stands, or they're using them based on their availability, which makes sense because until the growing season starts, you're really not seeing any plant response after that fire. So it makes sense that the vegetation or lack thereof is not offering turkeys much in the way of vegetation. Next. This is a figure showing a common scenario that we see relative to burn severity, and these are just D.E.E.R values. And basically, what you see is the ones are situations where turkeys are just traveling through. They're moving at a high rate of speed. They are traveling in a single direction quickly, versus the 2s and 3s, which are instances where birds are settling down. They're moving slower. And in particular, the 3s are situations where they are doubling back on themselves. They're exhibiting behaviors that are indicative of exploration, where they're going back and forth, returning and revisiting areas that they've already walked through. And we tend to see that there's a pretty strong correlation between the severity of the fire and these behaviors. In other words, birds are avoiding, they're not intensively using areas where the intensity of the fire was hot, very high. Next. But then the scale issue, again, kind of dominates a lot of what you hear in my part of the world. And many of the issues with scale are directed at some of the larger public lands in the South. And I get questions about this quite frequently. They are heated, no pun intended. If you read Facebook, every fire that occurs looks like that in this picture, where you have large smoke plumes and the fire is covering an extensive acreage on a landscape. And the question that's asked from many is, well, then how can a fire that consumes a couple thousand acres in a day be conducive to managing for this bird? So that led us down the road of trying to better understand the scale question. Next. Unfortunately, if you're a model hater, you may not, this may not resonate with you. Models are just simplifications of reality, and so in our case, we can't study every fire and every turkey, right? We catch a subsample of the population, and we monitor them. And as fires are occurring, if the bird is exposed to the fire, then we have a snapshot of their behavior after the fire. We have a snapshot of their behavior before the fire. And understanding that, well, we can't study every turkey and we can't study every fire, what we end up doing is basically using the data that we have to kind of simulate scenarios wherein different fire applications would be expected to produce X response or Y response. And so in our case, because a lot of our work is based on females, on hens, we developed a model that was an individual based model where each hen was the input. Next. And so what we did is we used the GPS data that we collect on all of these hens to teach this model how a turkey behaves, and I'll show you what that looks like. How far do they move per hour? How fast do they move per hour? They tend to turn in certain directions. What do their movement tracks look like? And then we basically teach the model what a turkey behavior pattern looks like, and then we create landscapes that are simplified, right? And so in our case, we created these landscapes that have patches. The patches are a certain size, and then these patches are replicated in designs where basically the burn unit is a series of these patches, and there's either a fire applied to it or there is not. And then we manipulate the size of those repetitive patches. We put them out in patchwork distributions across the landscape, and then we predict out how turkeys are going to behave in response to those fires. And we just set a standard landscape size, and then as you're going to see, we just increase the scale of fire through time. Next. Unfortunately, as everyone here understands, most fire units on our landscapes are not perfect squares or perfect rectangles. In reality, they're amoeba shapes in many cases, and they're much more complex than what these models are capable of having as input. Computational time becomes extraordinary on these types of models. So basically, we recognize that, but we also recognize that scale almost certainly would interact with shape, right? So, how a turkey would perceive a fire that has a different perimeter to edge ratio, that potentially could matter, right? So we created two types of burns. We created square, very simple square burns, and then we created some rectangular burns where the perimeter to edge ratio would be different. And so we applied both of these types of scenarios to these models and evaluated the turkey response. Next. And so here's an example just to show you this would be a scenario where you have these different types, these different stands that are managed in a way. So the red would be these stands were burned this year. The light green would be these stands were burned last year, in 2 years, 3 years, so on and so forth. And so we started out with these what we thought were fairly small burns given the scale of fire on our study areas. So we started out with 57 acres, which may seem like an odd acreage amount, and it is, but it's an artifact of the way the models and the patch sizes were set up. And so in this scenario, you have a lot of burn units that are available, and about 25% of them are burned every year. Next. Okay, so this is what you're seeing is we took these 40 hens and we just randomly put them on the landscape. Now these are simulated hens, right? So we put them at some point on the landscape and we just chose 40 at a time. And then we tell the model to run. And again, the model knows how a turkey behaves. So the model just lets turkeys be turkeys. And what you're seeing on the right is the movement tracks that the model predicts. And if you look at that spaghetti on the screen, those movement tracks, that's actually very, very similar to what actual GPS tracks look like, which gave us confidence that we had taught the model to behave like a turkey, because that's the way turkeys behave when you look at their GPS movement tracks. Next. And so, just to kind of show you some things, I put these two quotes in here because they're interesting to me. One being from Erwin Chargaff, and basically this idea that one of the most insidious properties of models is their tendency to take over reality in the minds of people that are interpreting them. And although I appreciate that, I tend to err towards Einstein's thinking, which was that all of the science we do, when you measure it against the reality of our natural world, is primitive. But it's really, in many ways, it's the most precious thing we have. So you start these processes and you understand that the predictions you're making are a simplification of reality. Um, so in this case, you have 14 hourly movements. We categorize whether turkeys were just walking quickly or whether they were spending time in an intensive kind of area. We taught the model this is about how far hens walk an hour, which interestingly enough is very similar from study site to study site, in that 200 to 250 meters per hour is pretty common for hens. And we used 153 females, and what we did, we used these females because these birds had been exposed to numerous fires in their landscape, and so their home ranges were in parts of these study sites that fire was a common application within, and so we felt like these birds would be kind of the model for here's how a turkey would behave relative to fire. Next. And this is what we found. Interestingly enough, what I thought would happen is that you would see this blue line that's showing this 50% reduction in use. My prediction was that as you progressed in scale, as you increased in scale, you would see this relatively static response, and then all of a sudden you would see an asymptote, and then predicted use would decline. And what we saw in reality was that there were almost immediate reductions in use as the scale started increasing above that 57 acres, which was the smallest acreage that we had. And so once you got out to around 300 to 500 acres, you started seeing that the probability that a turkey would use the burn stand was essentially the same as they would use any other stand that was available on the landscape. I put this red star there just to note that that's kind of that break even point, and what you tended to see was the reduction in use was slightly different from a rectangular shape to a square shape, but this was not as dramatic as we thought it would be. And inside this red box is kind of some things that I think is important to consider. And one is that turkeys in our part of the world, on average, are using around 900 to 1,000 acres on average. Of course, there's variability from one hen to the next during the kind of the pre-laying, the pre-nesting period. This would be from when she leaves her winter home range to when she starts laying, and that's usually several weeks, if not 6 weeks in many cases. And during the laying period, you're seeing a dramatic reduction in how much space she uses. So if you just looked at those two different scales, right? Let's just say 1,000 acres versus slightly less than 500. A 50-acre fire would consume anywhere from a third to about two-thirds of her core area, depending on the timing of when it's applied. But a 500-acre fire would consume half to well over the spatial extent of her home range. And so when you think about these numbers and then you evaluate kind of this figure, none of this is particularly surprising to me. It makes sense behaviorally, given how much space this bird uses. Next. And so kind of the take home that we kind of arrived on was, well, we know that turkeys maintain defined ranges and they don't leave ranges under stress or disturbance. And for instance, I'll give you some examples. So what we've seen on study sites where catastrophic wildfires erupted and we had GPS marked birds, is they did not leave those home ranges. They simply moved about the landscape and identified areas where they were safe from the fire, where there were still resources available. We saw the same exact observation looking at turkeys that are dealing with intensive hurricane issues. We've seen the same thing with large scale flooding that inundated entire bird home ranges. They still don't leave those home ranges. They essentially just sat in the treetops and moved about their home range as if they were on the ground. So they're not going to leave their home range. They're simply going to deal with the outcomes of whatever management scenarios we put on the landscape. The other thing that's important to realize is turkeys are allometrically scaled. And what I mean by that is, given their body size, they can only use so much space. And so in a given day, he or she is only going to be able to travel so far, given their energetic requirements and their body size. So that's back to kind of the observations that we saw relative to scale of fire. It really isn't surprising that turkeys would behave the way they did. And basically, the basics of their home range use supported the model results, which gave us confidence that they were biologically relevant. And then the question becomes, does a sweet spot exist for fires? In other words, is there the perfect scale to apply fire at? And I suspect the answer is no. It's going to depend on a variety of factors that are site and vegetative community specific. And the other thing that we don't understand yet, we're getting there, is the potential indirect effects of fire. And so, for instance, this figure that's in the bottom left, you have different colors that are representing stands within this hen's home range that are burned each year. So red would be burned this year, orange last year, etc. And so what we don't understand yet is, okay, if a bird has certain parts of its home range influenced with fire this year, are there outcomes that would transcend to next year or the following year? In other words, is her survival or is her fecundity positively or negatively influenced within parts of her range given management applications of fire that occurred in years prior? That's a little tougher question to answer. So it's taking a little more time and data to get there, but we're getting there. And I believe that is all I have. That is.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Chamberlain. As a reminder for folks, please post any questions you may have into the chat feature. I'll pull up our first questions. So our first question is, what all isn't good about the habitat with the brushy tree understory? Is it lack of food, poor visibility, lots of shelter for predators, or other factors?
All of that actually. Yeah, so if the question is why would a brushy shrubby understory not be conducive to turkey use, it's a combination of, as a plant community shifts primarily to woody species, you tend to see much less forage availability for turkeys. You tend to see that insect communities are not as diverse as they would be in a herbaceous or forbaceous plant community. And you also start seeing that visibility declines to the point where it's difficult for birds to navigate through it and to see predation risk coming. And so all of that factored in is why you tend to see birds shifting their use to more disturbed plant communities.
Thank you. Our second question. You used female movements to teach your model. Do you speculate how males might use a burn landscape differently?
Yes, we've actually monkeyed around with that a little bit. And males, really the only thing we saw different was males are going to move a little bit farther on average per hour, but the model results were very similar in that you tended to see the same behavioral patterns when you looked at the raw GPS telemetry. In other words, males, if they were exposed to fires, were still using the edges. They were still traveling through the center of burn stands at a faster rate than not. They were still more likely to avoid areas where fire was more intensive. And so from at least from the first snapshot we took, we wouldn't see any differences in the outcome of the model based on whether it was female or male based.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question before we get going with our next presenter. So our next question is, do you know the historic fire interval in these communities that you're researching in?
To some degree, yes, we do. I mean, obviously the fires across the southeast in many of our pond dominated landscapes were were ignited by Native Americans or were ignited by lightning strikes, right? So they tended to the return interval tended to be much less predictable than the kind of serial, applications that we use where we go back to a stand every 2 years or every 3 years. So in some ways, what we're seeing now certainly does not mimic, in many cases, what you would have expected to see historically. But it's the reality of the landscapes that we're working on.
All right, we have one more question in the chat, but we're going to move ahead and hopefully we'll get some time to address it later. So we're going to switch to our next presenter, which is Dr. Marcus Lashley. Marcus, if you can go ahead and start sharing your screen. Marcus Lashley is an associate professor of wildlife ecology, an extension wildlife specialist in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida. Dr. Lashley is co-host and produces the Wild Turkey Science, Fire University, Natural Resource University podcast. He also develops content for numerous social media platforms and a free, comprehensive online prescribed fire training program. In this presentation, Dr. Lashley will cover fire effects on white-tailed deer, wild turkey habitat requirements, fire effects on animal behavior as it relates to forest regeneration, and barriers to implementing prescribed fire to achieve wildlife and forest management objectives. And with that, take it away.
All right. Appreciate it, Tommy. Thanks everybody for being here. Really happy to be back. Not sure how much of the audience overlaps with last time, but I have a lot of new material to talk about in this particular presentation as it relates to managing for wild turkeys. So to give you a little bit of history about me and my focus on this, I have done a lot of work in the southeastern United States as well. And since 2007, I have had research ongoing. That was when I started my graduate studies, which both were focused on very similar topic areas. But all the way up till now, my research program has really consistently included habitat management, particularly forest management practices to include prescribed fire and how they affect game species. And throughout that time period, and especially here recently, that's focused a lot on managing wild turkey habitat. So I'm going to cover various things that I've been involved with over the years to hopefully give you some great information about how you can use prescribed fire to manage for wild turkeys. I like to start with these depictions of the United States, and I think they're really telling, and they're also, interesting to take a moment and think about. So I know When I looked in the chat, there are people from all over the place. I wasn't sure how focused the audience would be on Wisconsin. I know there's a few people in here, but several people from other parts. If you look at this map on the left side of your screen here, the lighter color is what we would predict based on historical writings and all sorts of historical data would have been open forest conditions. So that could have been, in the central hardwoods and southern Appalachians, that might have been oak dominated. In the Piedmont area, it may have been oak pine. And down in the south where I am, a lot of the coastal plain would have been pine dominated. But most of that area was characterized as open forest. And if you go back to some of the early European writers that were exploring the areas, that's what a lot of their writings described, was these open forest conditions. So if you look on the right side, I also think it's pretty interesting that that seems to match pretty well with lightning strike. I know a lot of the burning historically was from indigenous peoples, so certainly not diminishing that. But this landscape seemed to be quite paraphytic. And in fact, if you go and uh, look at the distribution of fire dependent species or disturbance dependent species, where disturbance dependent species are declining most frequently, those maps often look very similar to this lightning map. So I think all that to say, disturbance has been really important to our wildlife species, especially in the eastern half of the United States, all the way up into some of the northern parts of the US. So when you look at some of the descriptions, what they seem to paint the picture of is something like what you're seeing right here. So this will be in a pine savanna forest system. This system has relatively low basal area and dominated by pine, and it has frequent fire occurring. In some of the other parts of the United States, the descriptions fit more with this picture. So now we're in an oak savanna structure, again, frequent fire. And one of the things that I want to impress upon you is if you're thinking about what maintains a community structure in the plant community like this, regardless of what the trees are in the system, it's usually including frequent fire. Okay, so these savanna or these open forest conditions include relatively frequent fire. And what frequent means can vary quite a bit depending on where you're at. But the take home message is fire is an important part of managing a system to be in this type of structure. Another take home message for you all to think about is that turkeys evolved with fire, right? So I get the question all the time, and I know Mike just covered some really interesting data showing the movements. People are worried about burning because they're going to run their turkeys off. So I have seen precisely the opposite, and to the extent that a lot of our camera work and GPS work as well show that turkeys not only are not deterred by fire, but they're often using the stands even during the fire. We've had quite a few instances of that occurring. So fire has been a really important part of the evolution of turkeys. So in this presentation, I want to focus on the reproduction of the species because I think that's where we can really gain a lot from using prescribed fire to manage for turkeys. And in particular, I'm going to focus a lot on nesting and how it influences nesting success and also poult rearing success. So there have been various efforts to understand nesting success across the species. In fact, Landy et al. Published a paper in 2023 showing that they scoured the literature and looked for vital rate information on wild turkeys. And the most studied vital rate of populations was actually nesting success. And in their study, they uncovered 24 studies that they included in their meta-analysis, and on average, about a third of the nests were successful. So looking across all these studies, about a third of the nests are successful. Some of the more recent work that was included in the Lundy et al., Mike was involved with this work. Some of those studies have shown very similar nesting success, and some of them, if you look through the literature, are akin to these where they are above average. And there's quite a few anecdotes like this where the nesting success is well above what we see on average across other studies. Interestingly, if you take a look at some of those landscapes, and this is including some of the work that I have ongoing in Florida, when we see the nesting success high, it's usually because the landscape is being managed to be structurally very similar to what you're seeing in this picture again here. Another thing that is really common is not only that we have relatively frequent fire in the system, but we also have high sunlight penetration. I think that's really important for you to understand. Mike, a few minutes ago, showed a picture of a closed canopied, high density stem count in a pine stand that had been burned. When you are not allowing sunlight to penetrate to the forest floor, light is the limiting factor, and adding fire does not get you the vegetation response so that you can realize the real benefits that you could otherwise from prescribed fire for turkeys. So sunlight is a really important ingredient, and we see that really commonly across a lot of these sites. So let's talk about some of the things that are happening in the vegetation community with fire. So one thing that that is really pronounced with fire, and probably explaining why we see that really rapid attraction of turkeys to burned areas, is we have the release of foods. And in this case, I'm showing you some blackberries that are occurring. I'm not sure why my slide right here malfunctioned, but we see the release of several kinds of foods. I saw somebody comment about acorn availability and fall fire potentially reducing acorn availability. We've actually seen the opposite in terms of turkey response to those stands. If you're burning in the fall, we see the same attraction, and we see the consumption of acorns that have been burned seems to be much higher than otherwise use would be. So in this graph that I'm showing you here, this is detections of turkeys, and just showing you when you burn, you get this peak in use. So notice the blue line is when we have a March fire occurring. We have a peak in use and during May in those stands. This is relative to an unburned stand condition. And in the orange, you can see a very similar pattern, except in those stands we burn during June. Again, we get that nice peak in use after that, 6 to 8 weeks generally after is what we have observed. And that's been a pretty consistent pattern. This particular data came from pine, but we see the same thing in oak forest. Another thing I want to note is when we had the later growing season fires, and this has been pretty consistent even in our ongoing work, when we have those later growing season fires, June and after on into the fall, we tend to see that heightened use extend much further in time. So we see it on out into the following spring and summer often. So let's talk about some of the more long-term effects of prescribed burning. So one thing that's pretty important to turkeys is soft mass production in the understory. And if you're in a setting where you have a closed canopy condition and no fire, in these studies, we were observing about 1,200 grams per hectare of fruit. When we open the canopy, and I'm in this particular study, we wanted at least 30% sunlight penetration. We averaged 50% sunlight penetration in those stands. And when we added fire, you can see a substantial, almost 20 times as much fruit availability in that understory. Interestingly, the invertebrate production in those systems was pretty consistent between these two forest conditions. But what we see is an increase in use of the one on the right side where we have better structure. The conditions are safer for poults and the insect availability is more accessible. So here's showing you a fly through in a stand where we have variable retention of sunlight, or trees. So the sunlight penetration is variable across the stand, but we still have relatively high sunlight. And this is the year after fire in this particular stand. And we're seeing a pretty nice development of vegetation structure. Why I'm telling you that is really consistently in the literature, what has been important to hen selection of nest sites, but also the success of those nest sites has been the lateral cover associated with that area. And I'm talking about specifically under waist tall. So you can see me standing in the background there. The vegetation has a very high visual obstruction up to about waist high, and then relatively open above that height. So to show you some of the data, the ground cover responses in these systems, this is from upland hardwoods again. Notice the ground cover is relatively sparse when we're in that closed canopy hardwood condition with no fire. Adding fire did not change that ground cover response. Adding canopy reduction causes an initial increase in ground cover. And when you have both, they augment one another. And that's really important for you to understand. It's not just about adding fire, but also having an adequate amount of sunlight to allow the plant community to respond to that fire is pretty important. So just to show you how that affects the success or selection and success of turkeys. This was a study recently from Tennessee where they had a few hundred nests or a few hundred turkeys being observed over several years. And what they saw is that for every 10% increase in visual obstruction under waist high, we'd see a 2.2 times increase in selection for that site for nesting. So pretty intensive selection by hens for that type of structure. And the figure is showing you how that affects the success of her nesting attempts. Okay, so essentially, as you go across the gradient in visual obstruction, we're going from about a 24% success in nesting to about a 43% change. So pretty substantial effect of that lateral cover on her nesting success. So the problem that we're seeing really commonly, and in this Tennessee study, it was no different, of usually only a single-digit percent of the landscape we would classify in this early succession or shrubland community, whether it's in an open forest condition or in fields. It's relatively little of the landscape. And in their study, even though it was only 7.5% of the landscape, almost half of the nests were in those locations. They saw a 36% nesting success overall in the study, but that included that 12% of the nests that were occurring in these areas that could be mowed got mowed over. They were lost because the land manager actually mowed during nesting season and caused that nest to be lost. So if you assume that a large portion of those would have been successful, again, we're getting back to that golden standard of about half of the nest being successful. And this is pretty consistent when we see those high nesting success studies. Usually the high end is around 50%. So that seems to be where we're trying to get with these kinds of practices. Another thing that was pretty important in this study that this picture is an actual nest site and kind of describes having direct overhead cover is another component that's important. So having the visual obstruction, that lateral cover that we were just talking about and visualizing, having that paired with some direct overhead cover can also be important. It's also successful. This has been consistent all the way back into the late 70s, where this was noted secondarily as one of the things that hens select and that can influence her success. Okay, so here's a study. This one is not published yet, but it will be soon. This is including data from the Osceola Range and also the Eastern Range in Tennessee and Oklahoma. It includes several hundred hen years and hundreds of nests over multiple study sites in each of these states. And what we were looking for in the study were a couple of things. One, we wanted to understand how the plant community conditions were influencing nesting success. If you look here at the blue in particular, that's a 28-day nesting period. So that means that the nest is successful. It's gone through the entire nesting process with incubation. You can see when our visual obstruction is on the low end, again, we're in the mid-20 range in terms of the nesting success probability. And you can see we get up into the low 40s across all these studies when we get up toward that high visual obstruction below waist high. So seeing the same effect that's been commonly documented across studies with wild turkeys. Now let's shift focus to the hen. So it's one thing for her to successfully nest. It's another thing for her to survive her nesting attempt. And now you're looking at the hen's nesting survival. What we see is a pretty similar effect here. As you increase the visual obstruction from 0%, so imagine her nesting in an area that she's completely exposed, and we get up to where she has nearly 100% visual obstruction below waist high, you can see that the probability that she survives her nesting attempt increases substantially. However, that is only in the circumstance that the plant community is being driven by herbaceous plants in the understory. And if you imagine a system where the understory is transitioning into a hardwood mid-story dominated stem or visual obstruction. So in other words, when the visual obstruction, even if it's near 100%, but it's being driven by mid-story hardwoods, we see the relationship with her survival flip. So as you increase that hardwood mid-story stem count, her probability of surviving the nesting attempt plummets. And you can see when it gets really dense, that's a big problem for hens. So I know there was a question previously asking about the various things that were going wrong in that kind of condition, and this is one that I think is pretty important. It seems to be that the hen during the nesting attempt, if she encounters a predator in that system, because of that dense stem count in the mid-story, it seems to really be hampering her ability to escape or evade that predation event. So that could be really problematic because the hen, her survival rate is the most important thing driving lambda in the population. So really important to consider. It's not just about visual obstruction. The composition and what's driving visual obstruction is really important. So if you look in this picture here, this can help you visualize. In both cases, on the left side, we have high visual obstruction below waist high. The right side, we have high visual obstruction below waist high. But on the right side, the hen is at much greater risk in that system because of the hardwood community. And the other thing I wanted to point out in this picture, the main difference between these two stand types is that on the left side, it's had a 2-year fire return, and on the right side, it has not. Both were thinned about 10 years before this picture occurred, And we added fire on the left and did not on the right. And that's showing you the progression of those stand conditions over time under those two different fire applications. So another thing that I wanted to show you is, we talked about that initial attraction to stands. This is actually a study that we've published showing intensive management of the stands that are in dark gray. So those have been thinned down to 60 or lower basal area and have relatively frequent fire. In the gray ones, we used an application of Garlon and imazapyr to take care of hardwood problems in the mid-story, and frequent fire in all of the dark gray. And you can see the turkey use of those stands is exceptionally intense, the higher the intensity of management. So high sunlight, frequent fire, very important, very attractive for turkeys in the system. So let's think about this from a successional trajectory. I know a lot of you have probably seen various depictions of succession like this. So we're starting over here with a herbaceous annual plant community that transitions into the next seral stage that would be perennial herbaceous. Then you start to get woody plants colonizing here in the middle of succession, and that progresses on until some kind of climax community. So this is pretty typical of what you might see in that transition when you don't have fire in the system. And depending on where you're at and what tree species you have and how long your growing season is and productivity and all those things, this could progress quite differently depending on the system, but structurally, they tend to follow this kind of pattern. In this system, we will see nesting occur during this swath of time for us in southern pine with our productivity and length of growing season. That's about year 2 to 4 or 5 or 6, depending on the context. We see brood rearing occurring primarily over on the herbaceous plant community, especially when it's dominated by annual plants. What about with fire in this system? So if we started a plant community from ground zero and we just add fire, what we typically see is a pattern like this, where we retain a lot of this early successional plant community and herbaceous plants all the way into our late successional stage. And again, this could be achieved from, starting at ground zero with succession, or more commonly, what we're doing is thinning over here and then adding fire. But the point is we maintain that structure all the way throughout succession, and we see much higher use by turkeys regardless of where you're at in that. In fact, we see nesting really commonly occurring throughout these different parts of succession. We see brood rearing occurring nearly the full gamut of it. So I think Mike was talking about earlier how the hens were selecting to brood in the same year or the year after fire. That may be a little bit longer in terms of time since fire for you if you're in a shorter growing season or more north. But we see brood rearing occurring right after fire and nesting a little farther down the road. But fire is being applied commonly enough that you're maintaining this herbaceous dominated understory. Another added benefit that we're seeing in these stands is we're seeing a lot of use during the breeding season by turkeys. And obviously, that's a motivating factor for a lot of folks that are interested in turkeys and managing for turkeys. So I want to take you through a few examples where we have applied fire. And these are all going to be pine, but you can change the tree and think about how you might have changed the fire return interval to achieve a similar structure when we're talking about this. So this one was in Georgia. The fires are primarily in that late dormant, early growing season on our frequent interval. This system, less than 2-year return interval was the historical average. Same here. This is in North Carolina, except the fires were growing season and the length of the return interval is a little bit longer in that part of the world. But you can see very similar stand structure. This is in Alabama. This one again is more frequent fire return interval. This is during the nesting season in uh, this particular stand. This is in pine plantation, and you can see a little higher basal area, but this is post-agriculture. So we see some differences in the plant community because of that historical land use. What all of these stands have in common relative to one another, and relative to importance for turkeys, is that they largely don't contain many forbs. Certainly not dominated by forbs in these, and that's something that we've seen pretty commonly across a lot of our studies and across a lot of sites that I work with that have been burning at that time frequently, is that we tend to favor, excuse me, we tend to favor perennial grasses when we have frequent fire at that time of year. So I think I showed this last time. Some of you may have seen this before. This was a study that pulled 36 years of data, and they were looking at the weather conditions that would be suitable and that you could actively pull a burn permit under. And they were trying to figure out by month how many burn days would we have had based on the conditions, not only that the fuels would burn, but also that we could pull a permit safely. And you can see a lot of the burn days are concentrated in that time of year when we concentrate a lot of burning, but the most underutilized part of the burn window is that late growing season fall time period. And we see this is another study where we actually looked at when lightning was generating fire. And you can see this difference in pattern here. These white bars are actual fires that were set by lightning. And this was the fires that were set by us as prescribed burns. You can see that's concentrated there, especially in March. And the burn window where we have a lot of good burn days over in the late summer fall time period are relatively sparse. We don't see that many lightning set fires over that time period. This was a 40-year time period, but also we're not using those days with prescribed burning either. So just to go back to that figure, essentially what I'm telling you is we have a much wider burn window, but we're not using part of it. And I just wanted to talk about some reasons, especially from a turkey management standpoint, why we might want to use more of our burn window. The main reason I would bring to you, remember I talked about the lack of forbs in those other systems. So this was a study in pine plantations that we just published recently. When we're burning in the midsummer, one of the most marked differences in the plant community that we see develop over time is we nearly double the coverage in the understory of forbs in that plant community. Here's another study. This one is in the process of being published. These are sites distributed over Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Florida. And we see the same thing. One thing I want to note here is that it took us a couple of years to realize some of these effects, but I've got highlighted here the late growing season fire and the dormant season, which in this case included November, December, and January, tended to promote forb coverage. The problem or the difference between those two really, in terms of how they're affecting the plant community, was more obvious in this study where we were looking at some of our hardwood species that are in these communities. So mockernut, hickory, and post oak are both species that would consider to be on site in these uplands that are frequently burned. So they tolerated that frequent fire and have adaptations to deal with that fire. And then we have off-site or mesophytic species, depending on how you want to look at it, like sweet gum and water oak. The difference between that winter timing and the summer and fall timing largely comes down to how well we're controlling these problematic hardwood species. So we're getting the forbs from both of those timings, but we're not getting the control of hardwoods like we can show in this study, where we were detrimental to the particularly disproportionately toward mesophytic hardwoods in these stands. So all that to say, the timing of fire, I think, let me say that a different way. The frequency of fire, when you have adequate sunlight, is by far the most important thing because it is regulating structure. However, if you identify problems with composition, like some unwanted hardwood species or potentially reduced forb cover from ideal, expanding the burn window to include some other times of the year might be prudent. And also, I encounter this quite frequently. I generally am a proponent of just getting hitting your target frequency and burning when you can to do that. And I think this is showing not only burning at these different times could have some benefits, but the overall benefits of opening the burn window and allowing people to utilize days at different times of the year might help us to better achieve our frequency in many cases, especially in the deep south where that target frequency might be 2 years or less. So I'm not going to belabor this because I know I've been going a while and Mike already talked about it, but the scale can matter quite a bit. And, considering multiple objectives, depending on the adaptations of the species of interest and their mobility and how they're using burn units might change quite a bit what your target acreage for burn unit size might be. And I think that's an important consideration for you to think about. While turkeys might be in that 50 to 75 acre range, some other species ideally might have smaller burn units or larger, and obviously, logistics play an important role. So I also wanted to talk scale from a different perspective. So some of you might be familiar with the Florida Wildlife Corridor effort, and this is a huge effort across many agencies, state and federal, also many NGOs, tons of players, private landowners involved in this. And essentially, the idea is to protect land in perpetuity in highly connected from South Florida all the way across the Panhandle to Alabama and all the way up to Georgia. I would say this has been a really remarkably successful effort. And I think it also, some of the data that we've just recently collected and is in the process of being published now shows how important that is for a species like wild turkeys. This connectivity is quite important. And I just wanted you to see the dark green here is the wildlife corridor. That's currently land that has not been developed. And the key things that you can see that are different are on the right side. So you can see the human population density is substantially higher outside the corridor. And you can see the grassland, forests, and wetland in particular are substantially greater in terms of their proportion of the corridor within the corridor. So it's largely doing what it's supposed to. It's reducing urbanization and human population, and the composition is largely intact wetland, grassland, forest. If you actually look at how that is affecting the occupancy and relative abundance of turkeys, you can see there's a massive effect of this connectivity on both occupancy and relative abundance of turkeys. So all that to say, I think it's important for us to consider how we're applying management like prescribed fire at the local level, but also considering how we distribute that management across the landscape can be quite important. And in this case, even at the state level, we can show a really clear effect of habitat connectivity on this species. And we have data on other species, and it's preliminary, but I think we're going to show a very similar thing on quite a few species. So many of you may already be aware, but I have various platforms that I'm active on. We have the Wild Turkey Science podcast. I'd encourage you to listen there if you're interested in the stuff. We try to cover a lot of habitat information and fire information, but it's more generally on what we know about wild turkeys and studies that are ongoing or completed. Also, you can follow us at UF Game Lab and at Dr. Disturbance. We're really active on YouTube. I put lots of content out in video form for you to visualize things and cover lots of studies. And same thing, especially on Instagram, but other social media at Dr. Disturbance. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Tommy, and I'll take any questions if there are any.
Excellent, Marcus. You can stop sharing your screen and I'll take over. So our first question while you're doing that, do you have any additional resources to learn about nesting cover and ways to measure that visual obstruction?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. Maybe I can provide the links to you guys so that you can pair it with this video, but I just recently produced a video showing you how to measure it. And there's a tool that you can develop that you can do it on your own land, or that an agency certainly could support. It's just a board has sections of it painted. So it's really easy to measure in the field, and that's called a NUDS board. And I can provide that link for you. It's on our YouTube page at UF Game Lab, and it was just published maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, so fresh off the press.
Awesome. Sounds like a great resource. So we have time for one more question, and the question is, with turkeys having the tendency to select and use fresh plant material from burn treatments, have you considered research into the nutritional value of these plant materials?
Absolutely. We have a body of work showing a substantial increase in the protein quality and phosphorus and all of the nutrients that are available or that are mobile in plant tissue. So there are quite a few, like magnesium. There's quite a few micronutrients, and the nitrogen and phosphorus are certainly mobile as well. Anything that's mobile in the plant, you will see highly concentrated in annual forbs and resprouting tissue of plants after the fire occurs, and that tends to be concentrated in that 6 to 8 week window. And we see a very similar thing from herbivore responses, where, whether you're looking at vertebrates, where they seem to be following that pulse in nutritional quality. But the same thing we see in the insect community. The insect herbivore community tends to spike with that pulse and nutrient availability. And that probably is quite important to turkeys as well, because they're eating quite a few insects.
Thank you. It sounds like some good research coming up.
Yep, lots of things on the horizon.
Yeah. So unfortunately today we've run out of time, but we want to sincerely thank Dr. Chamberlain and Dr. Lashley for sharing their experience and expertise with us today. Please take a moment to evaluate today's session so we can improve this series. You can scan the QR code or click the link in the chat. The evaluation link will also be posted on our website. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again on May 7th from 10:30 to noon when we discuss fire and carbon. Have a great day, everyone.